Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Chelsea and I for today's webinar on applying to universities and colleges in Canada. We've both been a little blown away by the interest that we've had here. Well over 100 people registered from all over the world, counsellors, advisors, students and parents. So hopefully over the course of 45 minutes or so today, we'll be able to give you not only a little bit of information about applying to the university and college sectors in Canada, but also the benefit of the really important person here, which is Chelsea from the High Commission of Canada in the UK, who will be able to talk to you about what is happening with Canadian universities and colleges in the time of COVID-19, but also particularly how the High Commissions and peer institutions around the world can support particularly school-based counsellors and advisors with helping your students applying to universities and colleges. So my name is David Hawkins. I am the founder and director of the University Guides, and I'll be taking the first half of the presentation, and I'll allow Chelsea to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. This is my first time sort of speaking to a camera to a large group like this, so I'm really excited to be here today. As David mentioned, my name is Chelsea Lutich, and I work as the Trade Commissioner for Education at the High Commission of Canada here in the UK. I've been in the role since last year, and as part of this role, my job really is to engage with local contacts in the UK and to ensure that Canadian institutions have an opportunity to provide exposure to their programs and their opportunities to UK students. So obviously we've seen that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on the international education sector, and I hope today to be able to address some of your questions, and if not, to be able to point you in the right direction. So looking forward to being here today, and I'll pass it back to David.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. So a lot of questions came in advance. Chelsea is going to deal with a lot of those as we get to her part of the presentation. For those new to go to webinar, you will notice that there is a question section in the control panel. If questions come up as we go along, or you have any that you didn't get a chance to submit, please do put the questions into the box there, and I will moderate a discussion with Chelsea later on. Some of the questions that came in were very, very specific. How do I choose between two universities, or a particular subject? We won't deal with those very specific questions on the webinar, mostly because it's not fair for a webinar with 80 odd attendees on it to spend a lot of time dealing with one person's issue. But we have got those questions. Chelsea and I will triage them later on and get back to you with anything specific. So please keep your questions as sort of broad as they possibly can, and we will go from there. So without further ado, I'll head on to the first section about studying in Canada, and then I'll hand over to Chelsea later on. So I'm going to look at a very kind of overview sense of why students might be attracted to studying in Canada. And it's an option which has grown a lot. If you look at any of the statistics coming out of EduCanada recently, it's clear that a huge number of students from all over the world, including here in the United Kingdom, have become increasingly attracted to the option to study in Canada. And these are some of the reasons that I see. It is a broader degree in most cases than is possible in the single honours or joint honours UK model, where students who may not be fixed to a particular subject or major can study a broader course. But it is not as broad as a lot of places are in the United States. And so students who may be interested in the arts and humanities or the sciences can find that broader degree without necessarily having to step really outside their academic comfort area for a student who's followed maybe 3 A levels and is really fixed on the area of study that they want to do. There is a huge variety of geographic experiences in Canada, from the prairies, the mountains, the Atlantic provinces, world megacities, amazing geography. For students who have a desire to experience a very different style of life with exposure to all sorts of wonderful things, Canada gives you everything you need to do. And alongside that comes a really strong philosophy of campus culture, without necessarily possibly some of the more extreme things that we can see in other parts of the world. A very nice, welcoming, secure campus culture, both at urban and suburban campuses, as well as the college towns, giving students a huge amount of opportunities in there. It's a relatively straightforward application system. I'll touch on that in a bit more detail. And so for students who are looking to accent their applications maybe to their home country with another country, it's not a huge amount of work to pursue Canadian applications, and indeed some of the outcomes can be quite predictable. So students who are thinking, I am interested in adding another two or three applications and I think I'll get offers, Canada is a really easy way of doing that. It is obviously a very cost-effective option compared to international tuition fees in many places around the world, certainly cheaper than the United States on average, and within some of the name brand institutions, which again can be very attractive. And something that I see a lot in my work as an independent counsellor working with 60 odd students a year is that for students who are interested in broadening their abilities in languages, particularly in French, Canada, in Quebec, but also in other places, offers students a nice idea of a bilingual education, that they can study in English, but can work on another language, primarily French, as they are going as well. So it's some really good options for students to look up in here as well, which have driven a lot of the numbers that we've seen with students studying in Canada. So what are the key features that we're looking at in terms of here? What are the main things to be aware of when we are advising students? Well, the first thing is to understand that we're talking about a number of different education systems within Canada. And though we're going to touch on the theme, and Chelsea's coming this representing the federal government in Canada, education in Canada has actually devolved to the provinces and the territories, and you see them all here as well. And so you can find really interesting flavors of Canadian higher education, not just because of the geography of the cities, but because of the particular ways in which higher education is organized in each province. In a very practical sense, the province or territory that a university is located in is also going to potentially impact the way in which a student would apply. And so it's really important that students understand that we're not just talking about everything in Canada being exactly the same. You know, if you may be used to applying to universities in the Netherlands or in the UK or in Ireland, where it's one central system, but in Canada it is divided up in this way. What we've also got in here as well is quite significant variations in terms of the costs as well, that there are parts of Canada which are urban, have lots of business activity going on there and can be quite expensive. But equally, many parts of Canada where the cost of living is extraordinarily cost effective. And so for students who may be very cost conscious, studying at a world-class Canadian university, maybe located in an area where it's relatively cheap to live in, can bring the whole cost of tuition and the cost of living down to very, very competitive levels worldwide. So we have in there a provincial system of education with the 10 provinces and 3 territories, and it is the provinces that are doing these kind of things and have responsibility. So we do not see a federal ministry in here. What we are going to see is some nuance in between the different sectors. So some key features then to be aware of. First thing, and again, for those who may not be intimately plugged into what's happening in Canadian higher education, there are a huge variety of things out there they can do. And the numbers really are hugely impressive. That you see here the vast number of different degree programs, the vast number of universities and colleges that are offering all these kind of things. Big numbers of students going through the sector every year as well. So it's a very, very popular option. And because of that scale, comes a huge amount of variety of things that students can do. So both in terms of the style and the ethos of the institution, be that the college or university they want to study at, or be that the particular way in which a degree program is going to be structured. Because there are a lot of things on offer, students really can look for fit when they're trying to pick an institution and a program in Canada that suits them. They will find that the process of a bachelor's degree, then maybe going on to a master's degree, and for those who want to continue into research, a doctoral degree, is very similar to what students will be used to in other parts of the world. So it's recognizably on the same model as the United Kingdom. And you can see here a range of tuition fees. I put them in pounds, knowing that most of our audience today are from the UK. In terms of an average range there, a very competitive set of tuition fees. And again, cost of living will depend on lifestyle factors for that student. And indeed, as I said, which part of Canada the student is wanting to study in. So if students are attracted to this, they've got to the point of thinking, right, Canada is for me, then what are students doing when they need to choose a university or a college to look at? Well, a number of different factors are going to be really important to them. Fit is really, really important here. Canada doesn't really do rankings for universities, partly because they're all public universities and very heavily controlled within the provinces. Partly because of the geographic reality of, it's not as easy to necessarily head from one part of the country to the other to go to university. So within a province, there needs to be very strong levels of higher education. So it's very much this idea on fit. And I'll caution Canada students and parents joining us today that though there may be names of universities that you might see high on world rankings, things like QS and Shanghai and Times Higher Ed, It's important to bear in mind a lot of that ranking will come from the postgraduate work that is happening at a university. So a university's ranking in these global things could have actually relatively little reflection of what the undergraduate experience is like. Yeah, it might be how good are they at putting out research papers, you know, how much time would a taught master's student have in class, how much money is being spent on the facilities for doctoral students. That is not necessarily going to be a sign of how good is the teaching for someone doing their first degree. So though there may be universities in Canada that you feel are name brand and have a better reputation, as ever when we're looking at international missions, it's important to understand how good are universities within the context of the system in their country, and indeed, how would Canadians perceive universities? And if you look at things like Maclean's, which is a wonderful news journal which has a universities element to it, some of the universities that you'll find with quite high profiles in there may not be the ones that students in the UK will immediately have heard of. And so it's important to understand that just because you might only have heard of a number of Canadian universities, that may not be the best fit for your student, and the ranking thing may not be how it will necessarily work. So it's important to understand that. And then with this variety of the different types of universities and colleges that I've mentioned, students therefore need to look at that kind of experience when they're choosing. A big research university in a major urban area may be exactly the right place for one student to be fulfilled. But if they're not suited to that kind of environment, it doesn't matter whether the university has some massive international prestige if the student's not going to find that that works for them. So students would be well advised to select their universities and colleges based on the location where it's going to be, the size of that institution and the things that come with the size, the quality of the program and all the other things that they might want to do. The student who's really, really interested in, say skiing and winter sports, there will actually be parts of Canada where it's not necessarily the best place to do those kind of things, and vice versa. So important that students delve beyond these maybe perceived ideas of where's good and look at the reality, like a Canadian high school student would do. One factor then also to be bear in mind, and I mentioned how we're looking at slightly broader bucket of programs applying to, is that though there are more than this and there is more nuance to it, most international students looking to study in Canada, certainly from the UK and Western Europe, will be applying into a program of study. So rather than in the UK saying I'm going to go and study English literature, most Canadian universities you'd apply into a Bachelor of Arts, which would then enable you to follow a program of study including a large amount of English literature. But that Bachelor of Arts program, and again I'm generalizing here, it will depend on the university, but that Bachelor of Arts program would allow you to take other classes within the humanities and the arts in there as well. So an English literature student could take a class in French, could pick up some history, could maybe explore anthropology. And that's the same model in Bachelor of Science degree as well. So if someone wanted to do biology or chemistry or physics would potentially go into that program. And it creates a huge amount of flexibility for students who have identified an area of study they're interested in, but maybe not nailed it down to that one thing that they want to choose. Important thing to point out, and this is something that sometimes can catch the students out, that most business programs at Canadian universities will fall under a Bachelor of Commerce. And because it's a commerce degree rather than necessarily a business studies or business management degree that we'd have in the UK, there is quite an important maths requirement for students, particularly from an A-level and IB curriculum, wants to go into a Bachelor of Commerce degree, because there's a lot of maths in the Bachelor of Commerce degree. And so within that area of commerce, you can find things like international business and accounting and marketing and such like that. But it's not the equivalent of studying business management at a UK university because of that maths requirement. And then fairly self-explanatory, Bachelor of Engineering will also include all the different elements of engineering in there as well, with maths requirements and indeed some science requirements as well. So that's the key thing that students to be aware of, and sometimes can catch them out when they're trying to say, how do I find the entry requirements for French, and how do I find the entry requirements for physics? They need to actually look at what the entry requirements and the eligibility requirements would be for this general area of study that they would be applying into. And then once we're looking at that, what students will start to come across is what we call subject prerequisites. So the GCSEs and A-levels or the IB or indeed any other curriculum that your students maybe in another part of the world are studying will be equated to the various Canadian curriculum. And this is where the federal provincial elements of Canadian education at the university level comes in, because students in different parts of Canada are studying different curriculums. So a student in Ontario is going to be studying a different high school curriculum than a student in Quebec. And so within Canada, universities are already having to equate different curricula for entry to universities. And so it's fairly normal and very straightforward for them to do that internationally. So what you will then find is, for a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Commerce or whatever it might be, a university will be able to say to a student, based on whatever curriculum they're coming with, are you eligible for this program? So have you actually taken the right courses, so like I mentioned, maths for Bachelor of Commerce, in order to actually have a go at applying to our university? So that is the first point of decision. And then, and this becomes more and more of a factor, the more selective the university is, it will then come into how strong is that student within the applicant pool. And indeed, some of the universities which will bring huge numbers of international students in will also publish some information, not just on what that minimum level of eligibility was, but in a previous cycle for that curriculum, what was the sort of level that might have got you an offer. So it might be that we would need 3 Bs at A level and another couple of Bs at GCSE, but actually last year it was A star, AA, that got you an offer for this Bachelor of Arts program, for example. And so university admissions websites across Canada have a lot of this information. If they don't, the Canadian universities and indeed the Canadian colleges will be able to give you this information, and Chelsea will be able to also point you in the right direction. So once we've got to the point of students understanding that they want to go ahead and they want to apply, what happens next? Well, as I mentioned a few times, it is provincial or institutional specific. So in some parts of Canada, Ontario being a big example, students apply through a central system. So in Ontario, it's a thing called the OUAC, and that is a system a little bit like a UCAS or StudyLink, where you're putting your application in and then it is being sort of through a kind of clearinghouse out to the university. In other parts of Quebec, then we have other things going on. So there are other options where students can go and do different kind of things. So in Quebec, you would apply directly to the university. In British Columbia, there are some hybrid options and more versions for the different provinces of Canada. So it's really important that students know that just because I'm using one system for this institution, it's not automatically going to be the same for other institutions. And so then on these various different application portals students will be dealing with, we're going to see typically these kind of things asked for. So they want to know the student's educational background, what have they studied, where are they studying, what grades have they achieved. I want the normal biographical information, your date of birth, where you live, citizenship, and those kind of things. If it's one of these bigger systems like OUAC, your institution selection. If it's just for university, you'll just be looking at the course selection and putting those things together. So for those who are used to UCAS, we're very much looking at what a student providing is like UCAS, but without a personal statement and without a teacher reference. So it can actually be really surprising for students sitting down doing a Canadian application that they feel they've just done the starting bit and then they've actually realised they've done it all. So there's quite a lot in there that comes in. So that really was the overview of the key features of Canada. I'm going to flip over now for Chelsea, who's going to be able to talk about how the High Commission can help. The website is there. And Chelsea, you'll have to give me a nod when you would like the next slide moved on.
I will do. Thanks, David, for that comprehensive overview, and thanks again for inviting me to be a guest today on this webinar. I mean, I think really when we're talking about COVID-19, we all know that it will impact higher education and especially international higher education. I've heard education experts talk about, anticipating a recovery period for student mobility of lasting up to 5 years. So we know it's going to accelerate trends, some of which may have taken years to manifest. So I kind of want to premise this by saying that the Canadian government has invested significant resources into really managing this crisis in terms of supporting research and development, but also in terms of continuing to support international and domestic students studying in Canada. No one can confidently say sort of what the landscape will look like a month from now, let alone 4 months from now when students are due to start classes. But that said, all of our institutions in Canada are really proactively thinking about all of your concerns and to many extents have multiple scenario contingency plans in place to deal with the outcomes of coronavirus as the pandemic progresses. So David, if you could just go perhaps to the next slide. Sorry, the next one after that. Thank you. Sorry, David, next slide after that. Perfect. So study permits is one of the areas I'm going to talk about a bit today. I do want to start by saying I'm not an immigration officer. I do not work for Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada. And so while I'm going to deliver some sort of broad information on how study permits will be affected it's really important that you continue to monitor the IRCC website, and I'll provide a link to that at the end of the presentation. So if you have very in-depth questions about study permits, etc., I'll ask that you just withhold from asking them on this webinar. I won't be able to answer anything beyond the information I provide in this presentation. But if you do send a message to myself or to the London immigration team after this webinar, they'll be able to redirect you or answer your query as appropriate. In terms of study permits that students do require, I mean, if you are an international student looking to study in Canada beyond 6 months, you will need a study permit. And just sort of the basic information you should know is listed there on that slide. So you will need to have, before applying for a study permit, proof of your acceptance. You're going to have a valid passport as well, proof of financial support, and a letter of explanation. In terms of how to do your application, now normally this would be something that could be done by paper or online. At this point, though, we have received indication from IRCC that all applications will at this point have to be done online. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide as well. But again, that website there, www.cic.gc.ca, is the best website for you in terms of getting this information. If you could go to the next slide, please, David. Thank you. So I have had a look at the questions that many of you submitted in advance, and I also sort of have been thinking through questions myself, just in terms of things that I would want to know if I were a counsellor in the UK advising at this point. And I've broken down this section into four subsections. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on applications and admissions, on study permits, and then of course on autumn 2020. I did include a small section on the impacts on our EduCanada events, because as many of you students, families, counsellors will know, we do have lots of events that take place here in the UK to support student recruitment for Canadian institutions and to help students and parents meet with our institutions, as well as to help counsellors meet with them as well. So I'll talk a little bit about how COVID-19 will affect those plans too. So starting with applications and admissions then, one of the questions that's come up a lot is what is going to happen now that exams have been cancelled. And we have heard from the UK government that even if the lockdown measures are relieved in the next few months, these exams will still be cancelled. So what will that mean for applications? I have had discussions with lots of institutions in Canada. I've been sort of monitoring their websites. Most of our institutions have very comprehensive web pages that give you information on COVID-19 and the impacts on applications. And most of the institutions have kind of agreed that they're going to accept whatever grades are available from students. We do now know that Ofqual will adhere to the August 13th results dates for AS and A levels, and these will be accepted as formal and legitimate. The one note I would say there, though, is if you are a counsellor in a school which has a particularly unique situation where exam results may not be possible, or transcripts might not have been able to be sent, it's really important that you communicate with our institutions in Canada. And I think this is even more important now more than ever, I guess, because for some of the institutions, they won't be as familiar with the UK situation. Many of them may be more familiar with other international contexts and less familiar with the UK. So if you have a unique situation, or if there's any uncertainty over those exams, just make sure you're liaising with the admissions teams at the institution in Canada directly. And if you do need to get in touch with anyone, please do let me know. In terms of students studying other curriculums such as pre-U, international baccalaureate, French baccalaureate, etc., you can assume the same sort of situation. There will be some institutional differences. It's up to you to do the research and to check with the institution to see how they're looking at these various grades. And one point as well to note is that if a student on August 13th is not happy with the results they've been given and plan to resit their exams next year, it's important to be, again, consulting with the admissions team at the institution in Canada directly. There may be a case to defer, but again, that will be sort of institution specific. I have heard questions as well about students who perhaps have not had the opportunity to submit transcripts before school closing. If you are a student and you have not been able to submit those transcripts, or if you're a counsellor and you're not sure what to do now, Your best point of action is to get in touch with the admissions board at that institution directly. For the most part, transcripts will likely still be accepted electronically. And in fact, I think many institutions are even accepting unofficial transcripts at this point. Obviously, we're all having to be flexible. So just, again, get in touch with them sooner rather than later, obviously, to make sure that you can get those submitted. But for the most part, those kind of unofficial transcripts, electronic copies will be accepted. And a final question I had sort of was about SAT and ACT. So for students who are in the US curriculum and we're planning to sit, SAT or ACT testing, much of which has been canceled, the same sort of advice applies. So generally speaking, you're not going to be penalized necessarily if you have not been able to complete those standardized tests. Most institutions are showing leniency and will base submissions on sort of midterm grades, as well as any personal statements or other information you've provided on your application. So again, it doesn't hurt to get in touch with people in the admissions offices, but there is a lot of flexibility here at this point. In terms of scholarships, for the most part, at least with Government of Canada scholarships, deadlines have been extended. That being said, I suspect those deadlines will not be extended again. This is just simply because there has to be processing time for students before they head to school in September, if that's what ends up happening. So do keep an eye on those scholarship deadlines, but for the most part, they have been extended. That does not necessarily apply to institutional scholarships. So individual institutions in Canada that manage their own scholarship funds may or may not have extended those deadlines. Again, keep an eye on the pages of those institutions and of their scholarships to see what that information is. Which brings me to the next point, which is just sort of general application timelines and deadlines. So I'm sure many of you are wondering whether the timelines will change, whether deadlines will be changing. And at this point, we're just continuing to kind of keep monitoring the situation. And I think many institutions have implemented deadline extensions for applications. Many have kept those application deadlines the same. So you really will just need to check on those application deadlines and also on document requirements. I do really encourage students and also counselors, advisors to continuously be accessing student portals, particularly if you've got an application submitted or if you're sitting on an admissions offer, because this really is the way the institution is going to communicate with you and provide you with updates and advice on what's happening. So that really will apply as well to kind of tuition deadlines, housing deadlines, etc. So do keep an eye on the portals. If you have not yet applied and you're looking to apply, some applications for some programs are still open. That's not the case for every program, but there are still some applications open and some deadlines have been extended. Many, for the most part, I think as well across the board, applications in general just are still being processed. Staff are working remotely. We're all working remotely, and most staff still have the capacity to review new files. You should anticipate some delays in admissions notifications, but again, for the most part, admissions for autumn 2020 will continue normally. And again, those deadlines for the most part have been extended to some extent. There is really a lot of flexibility. Institutions do not want to make this more difficult for you than it already is, really, is the message I want to communicate. Tuition deadlines are likely to remain the same, although I have noted that some institutions are granting extensions if families are unable to pay deposits due to financial difficulties. So again, just check with the individual institution if that applies to you and your family situation. And then in terms of study permits, so with the study permits, again, as I said, I'm going to answer sort of some of the general questions you've asked, but if you do have additional questions, please just get in touch after the webinar and I'll make sure to direct you to the appropriate person. So for the most part, the document requirements have not changed at all. It's just that the process for submission has changed. So this is for applying for study permit. We've seen that Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada is no longer accepting paper applications. So when you are doing an application for a study permit, and you should continue as normal to do your applications, these have to be done electronically. Offices for Immigrations, Refugee and Citizenship Canada are for the most part still open. However, they're only dealing with essential services. So you can anticipate some delays with your applications for study permits. But they are continuing to process these applications. And if you do have a letter of acceptance for autumn 2020, you really should kind of go ahead and do that application as usual. Obviously, I mean, many of you have probably seen this online as well, but if you received a valid study permit before March 18th, that is still a valid study permit. You can on that still travel. However, anything from March 18th onwards, any study permits that are awarded are exempt from that. So you won't be able to travel on those permits until travel restrictions have been lifted. So do keep checking the IRCC website to see when those travel restrictions are lifted. But again, keep your applications as normal and just keep monitoring the situation. One of the questions that is really important and that people have asked is about biometrics. So with biometrics, evidently this has to be done in person. We do not have information at this time as to when those offices are going to continue to operate, when you'll be able to get your biometrics done in person. Just keep monitoring the situation. Keep looking at the IRCC website. Just prepare your application as if it were ready to go, and wait to see with the biometrics what happens. And we hope that they'll open soon, but of course we don't have that information in advance either. I've already mentioned that you should expect delays in processing time. This will include, for those of you applying to Quebec, the Certificat d'Acceptance to Quebec. Obviously, there are going to be delays in processing time. There are huge volumes of applications coming in, and these are being done remotely. The processing is being done remotely. So do expect some delays, but again, the process is happening. And then the final section I want to touch on before we talk a little bit about some resources and ways forward are the impacts on autumn 2020. So obviously, we cannot anticipate what 2020 autumn is going to look like. We're hoping, I mean, for the most part, institutions are planning as if students will be returning in September. The idea is that they will. We hope that they will. However, institutions are also, preparing contingency plans. I think at this point, we're wanting to ensure the health and safety of students more than anything else. This is true for institutions. It's true for the Government of Canada. So institutions will only open for classes if they feel confident and comfortable with having students there on their campuses. There are unlikely to be delays to, registration or orientation dates. For the most part, these will be unchanged. Same with move-in dates for residents. I mean, institutions really are preparing for business as usual, but again, with those contingency plans in place. It is important to bear in mind, though, that at this moment, especially for any students who may be on the call who are looking to go to Canada before autumn and who have already got the study permit before March 18th, it is important you are aware that any person arriving in Canada at this point, regardless of country of origin, must have a plan in place to quarantine for 14 days when they arrive in Canada. This is mandatory even if you have no symptoms, and if you do not have a plan, you will be quarantined in a facility designated by the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada. So if you want more information on that, you can find it online. And if you want information on sort of how Canadian institutions are helping students with this process, speak with the individual institution directly. The big kind of overarching question is, will classes be on campus or online? I have already mentioned sort of briefly the contingency plans. I think that these contingency plans are taking many different faces. We are seeing some institutions talking about a blended learning approach, some virtual online learning, accommodation limitations. Many of you probably know that in North America, students in residence and halls are often more than one student per room. So there's talk about how that will look like in the fall term. The point is that our institutions are discussing this. And again, as I said, ensuring the health and safety of students is the top priority for all of our institutions. I think institutions do recognize that any decisions that they do make will have repercussions on future enrollment numbers and financial sustainability. So they would like to have students in person in September, but we'll just have to kind of follow the trajectory and see. And beyond that, you'll just have to keep monitoring what the individual institution's approach is going to be. I think at this point now, most institutions have transitioned to sort of a virtual spring-summer term. But again, for the fall term, we're just going to have to keep monitoring sort of the ongoing pandemic. It is difficult to imagine sort of a return to full international mobility and complete lifting of social distancing measures, but that's something that is being discussed in great detail by the institutions and their boards and with government and health officials. What to expect though in the fall then? So many institutions have opened health offices that are specific to assisting students with sort of mental and physical health, so that students won't be alone. I've seen in the last month countless stories of communities coming together to assist international students who are currently on campus. And I think really pastoral care is something that Canada excels in at sort of the international education level. So there is a lot being put in place to ensure that international students who are there are being taken care of, and that international students who come will also be taken care of. There is also sort of the general following of advice from health professionals, so things like regular cleaning, access to hand sanitizer, physical distancing measures. These are all things that are being thought about and being implemented, and will be implemented when universities do come back full time. I think I'll probably leave it there. I think I've probably covered the majority of the questions that were asked in advance, but it is worth mentioning that any students that you're working with who are going to be impacted financially, this is the cohort that really does need to be thinking about what the next steps are going to be. There are sort of other opportunities that are worth considering. Online learning, there are more opportunities for transnational education that are being explored, micro campuses. And of course, there's always the opportunity to do an exchange if they decide to stay in their home country. So do ensure, if you have students who are facing those financial difficulties, you can talk through with them some of the options that exist. Okay, so then the final bit is sort of what are the impacts on EduCanada. So for those of you who are counselors, you'll know that every year we do run events for counselors. We come to schools on schools tours. We do have counselors who come to Canada House for an event every year. Obviously, at this point in time, Canadian and UK government travel restrictions mean that Canadian institutions simply can't come to market. So at the moment, physical fairs, school visits are impossible, and we'll keep monitoring that. But we do keep finding sort of innovative ways to ensure that information is being passed along. So for counselors specifically, we're exploring opportunities for virtual EduCanada events, virtual business-to-business meetings with Canadian institutions, and kind of webinars such as these. If you do have a specific request, just get in touch with me and I'll do my best to kind of oblige. I'm very happy to do presentations like the type of presentation David just did for you. I'm happy to work with your students and families. Just get in touch and we'll see if we can make something work. For students and families, we do also encourage you to take part in virtual campus tours. So a lot of institutions in Canada are offering virtual campus tours. This is a really, really great way to be able to see the campus without actually physically being at the campus, and to get a sense of what it will be like there. Often there are interviews with current students. There are tours of residents as well. So do take advantage of that. It's also worth mentioning that we are looking at exploring sort of virtual EduCanada fair options. We haven't ruled anything out at this point, but we're going to continue following the advice of our governments so that we can deliver our events in a way that maintains sort of health and safety measures. And then the final thing I'd like to say is that I know we do have, or at least I have some of my colleagues on this call today from other markets abroad. So if you are a student or an advisor who is not based in the UK, and obviously we've tailored this presentation to UK counselors and students and families, but if you are elsewhere in the world, it is worth mentioning that I do have colleagues who are dedicated to the education sector in other markets abroad. So do take advantage of that. There are other sort of EduCanada events happening internationally. And if you aren't sure who your local education person is, just send me a message and I can direct your query to the appropriate person. You can also use our EduCanada website, which will be on the next page under resources. You can use that to get in touch with questions as well. So that's been a lot of me talking at you. So I'm gonna yeah, there's the online resources page, and then I think David will maybe ask a few questions and we can talk through some things a bit more. I just want to mention the online resources quickly. So the first one there is the High Commission of Canada in the UK. This is a really great resource for you if you want to follow information specific to UK-Canada relations, particularly in light of COVID-19. The official Study in Canada portal is the EduCanada portal. So EduCanada is a really great place for you to start if you're a student or a counsellor and you don't know much about the system of education in Canada. It really is the place where every student should start with their exploration and their research into institutions and study. You can find tuition costs, you can find scholarships, you can find all the different programs and courses, and it's, you know, it's a really comprehensive site. I know that they have also recently put up COVID-19 specific information, so do have a look at that if you want more information. The Canadian Information Centre for International Credentials is useful if you are a student looking to study at particularly at the postgraduate level, or if you're looking to work in Canada. It's somewhere where you can get your credentials, your current credentials, transferred to Canadian equivalents. And then just below that is the site that I've been referencing a lot today, which is the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada website. So that's www.cic.gc.ca. So keep monitoring that website for more information. That's all for me, David. I'm ready to move on to questions if you'd like.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. Hugely comprehensive. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have just come in from people saying, or how do we get in contact with us and with different kind of things. Chelsea's email is on there for those kind of things. I think one of Chelsea's colleagues has just pasted something in the chat situation as well. If you go to the tradecommissioner.gc.ca, from there you'll be able to find who the local people are as well. Alessandra, I'm sorry, I can't read out the entire web thing you have pasted in there. So we've got a few questions coming, Chelsea, if you're happy for 5-10 minutes or so, just for me to throw those to you. Great. Okay, so the first one that's come in, we've got about the difference for students who are Canadian citizens or not Canadian citizens, but maybe are educated outside of Canada. How might that impact an application process for them, and how might that impact a sort of visa process for them?
So this is something related really to study permits. So it's not something that I can speak to authoritatively. Your best bet, if you are sort of unsure of how your citizenship will impact your ability to study in Canada, you should really check the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada website for immigration specific questions. In terms of opportunities to study in Canada, they'll remain the same. So we welcome international students from all over the world. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. The process for application will be the same. You know, it may vary a little bit for application for study permits, but again, you'll have to check that information separately. One key point to touch on that I know, David, you like to touch on when you do presentations is students who hold French citizenship. It is worth mentioning that there are some provisions made for students with French citizenship, and I know we've probably got some students from the lycée on this call today. If you do hold French citizenship or Belgian French citizenship, you are eligible to sort of be treated as if you were a Quebec student in the province of Quebec for paying domestic fees. So do take that into consideration if you are one of those passport holders when you're doing your applications. You do have a slight advantage in the province of Quebec.
Great, thank you. And for the specific questions, if someone is Canadian but educated in an international curriculum like A-levels, you will pay the same rate as if you were Canadian, but you will be evaluated on the basis of your school curriculum. I've got that correct.
Sorry, could you, I missed the first part of that. Could you repeat it?
So a student who is Canadian may be doing A-levels at school in the UK. Their fee status will be based on their passport, but their eligibility will be based on the school curriculum that they are studying.
Yeah, so your school curriculum is really what will determine with your application, you know, your eligibility for a program. So it's your school curriculum that you need to be looking at. In terms of fee status, again, that's something that you'll have to look into with your specific case. But in terms of how you are assessed by an institution, it will be based on the curriculum that you are following. So even if you are a Canadian student, if you are following a Canadian curriculum abroad, you'll be assessed in that way. If you're following pre-U, IB, French bac, A-levels, AS levels, you'll be assessed on that curriculum. It is worth mentioning that you know, there have been some changes to the French bac recently, and I know in recent years, you know, A-levels, AS levels have shifted quite a lot, even in the last 10 years. So some institutions in Canada will be more familiar with these curriculums than others. It is worth getting in touch with a particular admissions body at an institution if you are not sure how your curriculum will be assessed. Because, you know, they'll be able to talk through that with you. This is particularly a key point for advisors and counselors on the call today. Make sure you're in contact with those institutions to let them know your school situation and the curriculum that's being studied at your school.
Great. There was a technical question here about, on the study permit slide, you mentioned a letter of explanation. Is there some more clarifying information on that, or is that something that would need to go to the immigration services?
So, I mean, the best way, so on the Immigration Services page, you can find all of that in great detail. It's better to just go to that website because they do a better job of explaining it than I ever would anyway. But if you look on that website, there is a specific section for study permits. Have a look under that. It will tell you everything in great detail that you need to know about how to do that application. And there are also updates being posted on that website about how COVID-19 will affect things. Those documents and the documents that are required for your application have not changed despite COVID-19. So do bear in mind that whatever is written on that website is up to date, and that's the information you should be following.
Great. A question about students in future years. So for students who will be applying for 2021 onwards, where obviously the midpoint of their education has been disrupted a bit, will there be any significant impact there?
It's hard to say at this point what the impact is even going to look like in the next 4 or 5 months, really. My best piece of advice to students and counselors at this point is to kind of keep approaching this as business as usual, to keep approaching your education normally, to keep treating it normally. Institutions have been very, very quick, especially in Canada. Our institutions have been very quick about recognizing that, especially in the UK, things have changed, that exams have been cancelled, and they've been very quick to put contingency plans into place. And I suspect that in the longer term, we'll see even more of that. So if you are looking to apply in 2021, assume that things are normal, continue with your education as you have been, and just keep monitoring the institutional web pages to see sort of what information is being provided and what updates are there. But I don't anticipate it having a massive impact, certainly not like the impact that we're seeing for 2020.
Great, thank you. And I think I know what the answer is going to be, but are there any central lists of places that are still open, deadlines that have been extended? Is there any one-stop shop you can go to, or is it going to be institution specific?
It's going to be institution specific. So, I mean, you can use the EduCanada website for broad information. And there is there are COVID updates on that website. In Canada, as David mentioned, our education system is done provincially rather than federally, and in fact, every institution may have different approaches to applications. It may have different approaches to how it's handling the COVID-19 crisis. So you will need to access that information via every individual institution. Unfortunately, at this point, that's how it is.
Got it. We've got a couple of questions, just sort of technical things about students who may be renewing passports to get visas and all these kind of complications. I'm going to preempt your answer by saying this is something that Immigration Services could help a particular student with, and understanding that everyone's timelines are a little complicated right now. There's no other advice than that, is there, Chelsea?
Nothing beyond that. I mean, right now, obviously, with the offices are still open, but they're only handling essential inquiries. So what I would suggest is, if you have a question that's sort of less related to study permits, more related to passport renewals, that sort of thing, you can see just down below on that contact us page, there is a specific email for immigration and student visa queries. You're more than welcome to reach out to them directly with your queries, and they'll get back to you in due course.
Great. And then the last question that's come in is that a lot of the terminology with Canadian applications are quite different, and someone's asked about general admissions and honours admissions. Do you mind giving a little bit of an overview of that?
So honours being sort of an honours bachelor, I assume, is what they're talking about. Yeah. So, in Canada, and this is something we can perhaps go more in depth with in a future webinar for students and families specifically. But the notion of an honours bachelor's degree in Canada is essentially that the student receives almost like a first year, so it's a 4-year degree as opposed to a 3-year that you would see here in the UK. And the honours side of it is that the student will usually have to complete some form of big essay or thesis at the very end. The first year of that is often a little bit more general as well. So, the student in that 4 years' time is still getting the same quality of education as they receive here in the UK. It's just that in that first year, they have a little bit more opportunity to explore the degree and explore the options that they have. And then, it's obviously a 4-year as opposed to a 3-year. The general, and I mean, there are lots of institutions that offer both honours and general bachelor's options. There's colleges that offer these programs as well. In a general admission scenario, you would be looking at more like a 3-year degree program. There's also other variations of kind of certificates and diplomas and that sort of thing that you'd be looking at. So generally the honors bachelor's is unique to universities, although some colleges have started to offer university level degrees as well. But it may be worthwhile, and I'm happy to look at exploring a webinar for students and families specifically, so we can kind of get more in depth into this. And if you do contact me at my email address with any kind of more specific questions about the honors degrees that are on offer, I'm more than happy to help you as well.
Great, fantastic. On behalf of everyone attending, and I've noticed we have hit 101 attendees. We've had, I know, councillors who I recognise from well over 30 different schools just around the British Isles, and many more from places around the world. Thank you, Chelsea, so much for the prompt to do this, for allowing me to facilitate it, and for the wonderful expertise that you've given there. For those who haven't had the ability to visit Canada House in the UK, once we are allowed to, I would very strongly recommend both going to the council events and asking your students to go to whatever events that will happen, and indeed to make use of Chelsea as a great resource to support you. The contact details are there, the social media is excellent, and we're very lucky to have been well served for the year and a bit that Chelsea has been in this role, and for the number of years her predecessor Alison was doing as well. I think it's no coincidence that with excellent trade commissioners in the UK doing education, numbers of students from the UK going to Canada have rocketed up, so we're very grateful. For everyone who's joined, thank you so much for your questions. For those who posted a very specific question, we have logged those. We have got them. Chelsea and I will triage them, and indeed some that came in. Please bear with us. We are all working on disrupted workflows at the moment. This session has been recorded, and through the wonders of GoToWebinar, it will get to you at some point at some time soon. And so thank you once again to Chelsea. Thank you everyone for joining you, and we hope we have done at least something here to demystify some of the complications students are facing. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.